myself in a second. But this November is the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. I know that affected Europe, England, a lot more than it did the US, but there's 16 million people that died in this war. That was almost 1% of the world population at the time. So I just wanted to recognize that and remember that this year. My name is Brian Powell. I'm the Vice President of Engineering at a company called The Zebra in Austin, Texas. I've been a software engineer for a little over 30 years. I started out at National Instruments. That's my LabVIEW connection. I worked there for 26 years, and mostly on the LabVIEW team. And then I went to another company called Athena Health. It was in healthcare, electronic medical records. And then my current company is a small startup in Austin. And so in that time, I learned a lot about software engineering. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So it's kind of that journey that I've taken over the years, trying to apply software engineering. So first I'll start with our giant Athena. And so what I did is I actually asked my development team in Austin for suggestions for who I should talk about. And we pride ourselves on our diversity. We have developers of different genders and different sexual orientation and race, and we even have some developers in Africa that work with us that are part of our team. And so the suggestion from my developers was this woman named Ellie Price. And she is in Austin, and she is, founder of Front Gate Tickets. That's the company that sells tickets to the Austin City Limits Music Festival, if you ever come to Austin. That company got sold and bought by Live Nation, which is another big ticket company. There's a startup incubator called Capital Factory in Austin that is one of the best and most successful startup incubators in the world. She was co-founder of that. And her latest job, among other jobs, is to be executive director at the new Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. And this is a medical school that has come into existence in the last 2 years and is really trying to do innovative things. So I just wanted to recognize her. I have that quote in there from an interview that somebody did with her a year or so ago. And it just kind of shows how she started, and she kind of backed her way into the computing world. But she's the giant that I wanted to talk about today. Okay, so my team at the Zebra really likes this picture. So I had hair, I was skinny. This was probably late 1988, early 1989, is my guess, in the LabVIEW room. And so there's a bunch of inside Macintosh manuals and X Windows manuals and a floppy disk and a phone. So, and books, yeah. Somebody said that's the Stack Overflow of 1988. So this is really where I grew up, was at National Instruments. And so one of the first things you learned working on the LabVIEW team was how to do source code control. Because we didn't use some modern thing. Git didn't exist, and Mercurial and SVN, those things didn't exist. So we had a server that had the master source code, and we needed, basically you just copied the files up to the server. And so we needed some mutual exclusion protocol to make sure that two people weren't trying to clobber each other's changes. So a guy named Jeff Parker, who was on Fob's slide yesterday, had brought his lunch in an orange Tupperware bowl. And he decided, okay, whoever has this bowl has permission to copy to the source code control system. So that is, I'm pretty sure in the NI archive somewhere. I asked Jeff Kay if he could find it for me, and he tried, and he couldn't find it. But he sent me this picture instead. And anyway, there was a lid to the bowl, and so if you had the lid, that means you got the bowl next. And then also, it's a one-element queue, right? And so, and then we added a notebook to it, so you could write down what you actually changed, so that the next person could see what the last person broke. And then this picture is actually one that I think NI did for maybe NI's 25th anniversary or something like that. But it was an old Macintosh, an old Lab Windows CVI mug that when you put hot water in it, it reveals Lab Windows. And there's a picture of Jeff Kudowski there at his desk. And double stuffed Oreos, because that was the fuel that the LabVIEW team used to build LabVIEW with. So anyway, and I'm trying to remember what LabVIEW block diagram was. There was one LabVIEW block diagram that I rebuilt about 1,000 times. So that was actually based on a railway car detecting anomalies in wheels. And it took like 20 minutes to load in LabVIEW 1, and I think it crashed LabVIEW 1 when it loaded, but if you actually got it to load, it would run for 20 minutes, and in LabVIEW 2, my job was to bring that down to it could load in a matter of like a second and could run in 20 seconds. So it was a cool project to work on. So anyway, that was my first introduction to software engineering, was an orange bowl. It's like, okay, that makes sense. It turns out there were more modern ways to do things. So that's not all I learned. So over time, I should start. So NI, when I started, was about 100 people. The LabVIEW team was a dozen people. We had a block diagram room and a front panel room right next to each other. About half a dozen people in each one. And over time, when I left, the LabVIEW team was probably a couple hundred software developers. The company had grown to 7,000 people, grown to $1.2 billion. So in there, your process has to change, right? You have to be able to adapt and grow. And so over time, we kind of figured out that the whole idea of how do we need to improve our process is its own engineering problem, right? And so you can attack it like any other engineering problem. You can brainstorm different things, you can try them and see what works and start to apply them, figure out how to fine-tune the process. And so one of the things that we really started to do is pay attention to process. Maybe that took us about 5 to 10 years to decide to do that. Because there's a lot of, the ad hoc stuff was working for us. And over time, though, it's like, there's too many mistakes happening. One of the things I say is a lot of the LabVIEW software engineering process is designed around managing Jeff Kudowski, who's the founder of, right? Because he used to just like rewrite how wiring worked in LabVIEW over the weekend and check in all of his source code. And on Monday, everything would be broken. And so it's like, maybe there's some process we could put around this to improve things. So we started to add more and more process over time to save us from ourselves more than anything else. We added things. Well, eventually, we actually used real source code control. We moved to, at the time, Perforce, which a couple of different companies I worked at have used Perforce. It's a good centralized database kind of source code control system, if that's what you need. And we started creating a build process, built in LabVIEW to build things. One of the stories I tell my current development team is the whole idea of a test suite. Like I have it, Fabiola, I think I sent you this, my one-page document on the proposing that LabVIEW have a test suite. And I think it was upon the momentous occasion of the LabVIEW test suite. And it was really just sort of this manifesto of that we're never going to completely test LabVIEW, but maybe if we just got started and started writing a few tests and then just added more over time, focus on the weak areas of, what are the things most likely to break? Well, let's write some tests around that and start to test that. And that was a novel concept back in, that was probably the early 90s that we just decided to do that. And then eventually it turned into part of our build process as part of this continuous integration process that was built over time. And, the big test suite, at least when I left, probably took about 12 hours to run. We also had a much simpler version that was could run in about a minute. And so you actually ran that on your system before you submitted anything to the master source code. Then there was another one that's a continuous build process that on the master source code that would email whoever submitted the change that broke, it would email them and email their managers and say, hey, the build is broken and we need to fix it. And it actually would stop anybody else from submitting source code until you fixed it, right? So that's an example of where we went from an orange bowl where things broke all the time to over time as you add developers, if things are broken, then it's really painful for a lot of people. And so you really want to start to put more process around things to make that better. The other thing that I learned as part of evolving our development process over time was to have a reactive process for changing our process. Does that make sense? So there's a process for changing the process. And we do it reactively. And so that may seem counterintuitive. Oh, don't you want to be proactive and get ahead of things? And what I want to guard against, even to this day in my current company, is oh, I read a book on management. We're going to start doing everything that book says, right? That's the wrong way to do it, especially on a team of 200 developers, because people will just disagree with you. On the other hand, the approach we really took is we are going to suffer some pain because our process isn't quite right. And through that pain, we're going to recognize what are the things that we can do to make this better. Because it's an engineering problem, and we like to fix problems. If you proactively do things, you're guessing what the problems are. But if you really have an engineering problem and you really need to solve it, then you're going to have a more critical eye on how good the solution needs to be. And you don't want it to be too much solution, right? You want it to be minimally sufficient to solve the engineering problem of developers are breaking things, or developers are getting bogged down in testing, or getting bogged down somewhere else. So this approach to reactively changing our process also means that when you go and change the process, people are bought into it because they already suffered that pain, right? I have, through the last 3 months, suffered through slow build times or something like that. And now we do something to fix that. It's oh, we should definitely do this. We should definitely document our code better because that fixes a problem that I saw. And so that's another way of selling the idea of process change to a large team of developers. I want to open it up for any questions at any time during this presentation. So this is a phase where I've been talking about National Instruments. I'm going to go on to Athena Health, then I'm going to go on to the Zebra and talk about how that's different. But here on this NI part, are there any questions? Because I have a ton of stories that I could tell about my time at National Instruments and about process and about management and so on. Okay.
So yeah, who for the NI side? Who was it? One person said Yeah, so when you were at NI, when you were just like, some guys in a room kind of thing, who was it was it one person that said things need to change, this isn't working, or was it kind of a collective thing, or was there was it everybody thought, we're wasting a lot of time because things don't work, or was it just one person that says, hey, I've had an idea? Was it?
It's a good question. It was pretty much a collective thing. We did a pretty good job of what are now called in the Agile world called retrospectives. More like lessons learned meetings. And so we did a lot of, how could we be doing better? Probably because one of the other jokes I tell is like when I started at National Instruments, we were 6 months away from releasing the LabVIEW 2 rewrite. We remained 6 months away from releasing the LabVIEW 2 rewrite for 2 years. And so there's a whole lot of introspection that you're doing about why is it taking so long and how could this whole process be better. So a lot of it was just kind of baked into how we operated to figure out, were we really doing the minimum necessary with LabVIEW 2.0? Were we, Jeff Kodosky talked about, we will release no software before it's time. And so you're doing a lot of that kind of thinking. Over time, so a few of us kind of stepped into this role of actually paying attention to the process more. There are, especially as we grew to 200 people, there were people who just, leave me alone, I want to write code, which is great. And then there are also the people of, I want to make 200 developers successful. And so there are different mentalities that people took on. So in, I think it was LabVIEW 5, I took on the role as the first NI project manager. So NI did not have any project managers before that, and before LabVIEW 5. And so, and it was just this idea of we have, probably at that time, 75 developers that are all working on things. And LabVIEW 5 was where we added undo, we added multi-threading. And so we had to rewrite all of LabVIEW for the third time, I guess. Because the undo touched every part of the LabVIEW editor, and multi-threading touched every part of the compiler and runtime system. So more or less, we rewrote all of LabVIEW to make that work. And we introduced milestones. It was a year-long project. We introduced milestones to measure where we were. Those were novel concepts to NI that we'd never done before. And it was just probably, LabVIEW marketing and LabVIEW marketing, which was kind of the product manager trying to control or estimate when we're going to be able to release, and a whole big engineering team that you're trying to herd like cats in the right direction. So, that's kind of how we took a view of that. Does that help answer that question?
So to follow Darren's question, so when the team collectively realized we have a problem, was management close enough to you guys to see the problem as well, or did you have to sell to management from time to time, we have a problem that needs to be solved?
Well, for the first 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, management was Jeff Kodosky. And because he sits there with the LabVIEW team and writes code all day long, he's plugged in. Yeah. He still is to this day. He's just not management anymore. There's a whole different management structure. And I can't really comment on how things are today because I left NI 4 years ago. Oops. Let's go back. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So next place I worked was Athena Health. I should say, when I left NI after 26 years, so I'd done software, it's hired on as a Macintosh programmer at NI. After 7 years, we created management positions. I became a group manager for the LabVIEW measurements team. After about another 7 years, I said, I'm tired of management. I want to help, so I want to be on the individual contributor track again. And so I went back to being an architect on the LabVIEW team. I worked on some LabVIEW measurement stuff. I created LabVIEW Robotics, which is a really cool thing. Then after that, I created the field architect group with Nancy and a guy named Charlie Knapp, who's in California. And the last 3 years I was in NI, 3.5 years, it was all about customer success and customer proficiency. It was under the theory of if you make NI customers better at LabVIEW, they will buy more stuff. And we proved that. You know, we did that. It was really cool working with some, you know, really big and amazing customers, and really turn around some of those engineering groups that we worked with, and get to see how they grew, and then how much more confident they were able to use NI products, how much more they were able to do in their own companies because they were better LabVIEW programmers. So we created a bunch of CLAs, and it was a really fun project. Around that time, or you know, beginning a few years before that, NI's financials started to flatten and the culture kind of fell apart. And actually, that's going to be a theme in this next section. So the NI culture was frustrating to me being in the marketing side, because the last 3.5 years I was in a marketing role, and I had a team of field engineers who were, one was in sales, and you were paid for by marketing. And so it was really annoying about the political stuff associated with creating this small team from scratch, proving that you have value and still not being able to grow that idea. And so I was really, my emotions were wrapped around the axle, is what I say. And so I just needed to get out. And so I talked to a friend of mine who'd gone to another company, Athena Health, and just got plugged in there. And the pitch I made to Athena Health is they were a small, they're a $1 billion company, one. They're based in Boston, but they had a small Austin office of about 30 people. And they had plans to grow that office to a few hundred. And so, well, that's an engineering problem. That's cool. That'd be fun to work on. And so that was kind of my pitch to Athena Health, is that I have grown engineering teams from small to large. You can really screw up the culture. You can screw up the process. There's a lot of ways you can mess up. I've got some experience in that. I don't have a silver bullet, but that would be a fun engineering problem for me to work on. And so I actually joined Athena Health to go and help grow their office. Their office right now in Austin is this old 1950s power plant. It's called the Seaholm Power Plant. And it's this big concrete building that's hollow on the inside, 2 floors down, 2 floors up. Giant bridge crane overhead from which we hung a giant disco ball. And when the sunlight comes in these windows and hits the disco ball and the whole place lights up, it's amazing. And I mention Athena Health because it's kind of an interesting study in, we started out with a great culture the first 2 years I was there. In a lot of ways, it was sold to me as, this reminds me of the NI culture when we started many years ago, from one of my colleagues that had already gone here. And in a lot of ways, that's true. My second 2 years at Athena Health, it fell apart. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But, and then I'll talk about the ending of my time at Athena Health here in a little bit. So when I first started at Athena, they did have some problems, right? It was a giant monolithic code base. I was telling somebody last night how, like, their app is so big. It's a web application. It's a web-based electronic medical records and revenue cycle management and patient communications and population health and several other products all rolled into one big application. I think it was 11 million lines of code. And it actually requires the biggest computers that you can buy, right? Each computer, each server had 768 gigabytes of RAM, giant database servers, giant disk space, and so on. So physically, you cannot grow the application much larger because you won't be able to like add more RAM. You can't do it, right? So the first couple of years, they were kind of living in denial that they needed to really address that. They had a bunch of ad hoc processes. They had a homegrown task management system that was exactly what we needed because it was homegrown and we built it ourselves. That's not unlike what I did in the early days. It's like, it is exactly what we needed because we built it ourselves. And so there was, we did a really good job of planning our releases. We had bi-monthly releases, and so we had these segments where you spend like 2 weeks of planning, and then you have, that's kind of like the business side, just kind of deciding what business priorities are. Then they spend a week working with engineering to size stories and figure out what can actually fit. Then you have 2 weeks of what we called Earth. We had phases of, we had sky, earth, bronze, silver, gold. We call these phases. So sky was we're planning. Earth is when we're bringing it down to earth with the talking to developers. And then bronze was spending a couple of weeks developing code. And then silver is where I'm trying to wrap things up and doing some QA and fixing bugs. And then gold, in theory, is just, you're moving on to the next thing. So actually, sky from the next release overlaps with gold. But if you need to fix a bug, you can do that in gold. And then had a really great QA team and basically pretty reliable process for getting this healthcare software out the door. And like I said, great culture, a lot of different reasons for the great culture. So then, 2 years in, they hired a new CTO. And he rightfully recognized that the biggest looming disaster for the company was, I need to break apart this monolith of 11 million lines of code. And so he very much got into this, so we're all going to go Agile training, we're going to do formal Agile, we're going to move to Jira as our task management system, we are going to create a platform for doing microservices, we're going to spin off another, say, 20 or 30 teams to go work on microservices. And that turned out to be the beginning of the end. And so it was a great idea. Those are absolutely the right things to work on. In my mind, it was just badly executed. So like Agile Training rolled out over the course of 6 months. So it's not like, hey, everybody just do Agile Training, and now everybody is on the same process and everybody is speaking the same language. No, there's this 6-month window where, and Austin was, being a remote office, was the last one to be trained. And so everybody was expecting us to behave agile, and we didn't know what they were talking about. And so that was a very frustrating 6 months. The whole tool chain took a lot longer to come up with a new build system based on Bitbucket was the source code control system we moved to. And so a lot of the tools didn't quite work right for several months. Then this whole idea of this platform system, we had teams that were trying to implement new features. They were required to use a new platform component that also did not exist. And like my teams in Austin worked with platform teams that were in Boston, And the platform teams in Boston were close to the CTO, and we were not. And the biggest failure was the platform team wasn't interested in, and this is my bias because I'm in Austin. Right? The platform team in Boston didn't really care about the details of the end user features. They were building, like an example would be, there's a platform team building a directory system, and it was going to be a directory of patients, could be a directory of providers, doctors, nurses, things like that, a directory of allergies, a directory of medications, nice and pure, directory of anything. And it's like, well, I'm building a patient directory. And one of the challenges you have in a directory is, how do I make sure that I don't add a duplicate? So I'm a patient, my name's Brian Powell, and so what if a nurse writes it down as B-R-Y-A-N instead of B-R-I-A-N? I don't want a new medical record for me that's, just my misspelled name. Or they get some other part of me wrong, right? So you do this idea of patient matching, or name matching to figure out, oh, this is really a duplicate record, and so we need to merge those things, right? The rules for how you merge patients is entirely different than the rules for how you merge medications, for example. Like one of the examples we used to use was, I have two patient records. They have the same last name. They have similar first names, but not exactly the same. They have the same address. They have the same insurance ID. They have the same birthday. Should I match that? Twins. So your algorithm, if you're building a pure directory system, the algorithm says there's a 99% match. Unless you, or the other thing was under 26 years of age. Because in the US, if you're under 26 years of age, you're probably on your parents' insurance. And then after that, you're probably on your own. And so that's an example where this team needed something that this platform team had no interest in delivering in a feature. And so this kind of failure of communications, this failure of alignment on things, really started to cause a lot of problems. It caused a lot, like this team couldn't deliver anything until this team delivered something. And it was a lot of chicken and egg kind of problems. The other piece, and this is where this comes in, is that the CTO liked to micromanage stuff. So for example, all development teams shall consist of 3 developers. All Scrum Masters had to be a lead developer or higher in title. And personally, I think that's crazy. There shouldn't be strict rules about how you solve the problem. You should give autonomy to your development teams and let them solve the problem. So let us decide whether 3 developers is right. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 7. But let us, you can give guidelines of what you want to try to accomplish, but there shouldn't be hard and fast rules. And the larger your company, the more important this is, right? Because what we call the ground truth of whoever is there actually in the development team, they have a lot more knowledge about what's working and what's not working than somebody on high that's dictating how things should be happening. The other part of that is dissent should be welcome, right? The other piece of the puzzle, and this leads to why I left Athena Health, is the CTO can claim to be welcoming your opinion, but if in the end it's going to be held against you, then this is a problem. NI had this also to some extent. There were some people at NI that did not welcome some of the feedback. So this is one of the things you have to watch out for culturally. This is a really important cultural thing. You need to leave room for people to say, hey, I want to, let me put it this way. So one of the cultural values at Athena Health, which I thought was really, really important, was this idea of universal positive regard for others' intent. So universal positive regard for your intent. So that means if I'm in this big debate about what should be happening and we disagree, at least I want to know that you and I are trying to work in the best interest of the company, the best interest of the customer, whoever it is. That's where we're coming from, and then we can disagree on how to do that, but I'm trusting you, I'm giving you that universal positive regard to make that happen. That is a really important cultural value that I've also tried to bring to the Zebra. And so from there, you can disagree, right? If on the other hand, you are like, I'm assuming you're an evil person, and you are just here to like kill patients, then there's a problem, right? So that I thought was another really important piece of the puzzle. Okay, so then Athena Health ran into financial difficulties, and basically used to having 25 to 30% revenue growth on hundreds of millions of dollars, and then had a quarter where it was 0% revenue growth. Time to panic. The stock price tanks. An activist investor got involved, started attacking the CEO publicly, and a whole bunch of big mess happened, leading to a 10% layoff in workforce, including all of the Austin leadership. And so that's part of the dissent is not welcome, is, hey, some of these people down in Austin are complaining too much. And so my boss, who was a VP, got laid off. His boss quit in protest a few weeks before. The head of design and UX in Austin got laid off, and some other people got laid off. So that leads to the next organization called the Zebra. It is a 100-person company, kind of like when I started at NI. About half of it is engineering. It's actually in the car insurance world. So in the UK, as I understand it, the way you buy your insurance is you go to a comparison website and you give information about yourself, and then it leads you to some different companies from which you can buy insurance, right? And so one of our founders had lived in London for a few years and seen that and saw how the US did not operate that way. In the US, all the insurance carriers got ahead of the game, and they become the destination for where you go buy insurance. So there's these big companies in the US like Geico and Progressive and State Farm, and so you go to those websites and buy insurance. So the Zebra is trying to bring the UK model to the US. And basically, you know, which is the right carrier for you. So it turns out the underbelly of the technology of the insurance world is terrible. And so it's really hard to get APIs to talk to these insurance carriers, and you're pretty limited on how much you can do. But it's kind of a fun project to work on, it's kind of interesting. And there's a ton of money in financial services.
So are you officially saying, you stand up there saying something done in the UK is better than something done in the US?
That was my intent, yes.
On tape, so perfect.
So, once again, a great culture. I went here because of the culture. I was laid off on a Thursday. My first interview with the Zebra was the following Monday. It's one of Austin's best places to work. This is the barista station, so we have a coffee bot where you can order your coffee and then it sends you a Slack message when it's ready. You can pick it up. We're on the top 2 floors of a 21-story building in Austin. We have this beautiful view of the lake down there. It's really close to the convention center where NI Week is. And it's just an interesting place to work. I am by far the oldest employee of the company. I can see it. They break down like demographics on our employee base, and I'm like this little outlier. So one of the other things we often do Q&A. Like I went to Nigeria in June to visit. We have a dozen developers there. I went to visit. And we had a Q&A session. And one of the questions that was posted was, Brian, if you could change anything about our process, what would you change? And I said, I can change anything about the process. I'm in a small startup, right? I come from these giant companies where you can't really change process, and now I'm in this one where I can change the process. So I get to talk about what I was actually trying to do as part of changing that process. And this is probably one of the biggest things that I instituted at the Zebra. We were deploying new code every other day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. All of our tasks were sized to be 2 days. And we were going so fast, we were making a lot of mistakes. And so we were also operating in Kanban. How many of you know what Kanban is? Okay, good, about half. So for those of you who don't know, it's basically you're working on the most important task at the moment. Like you just go to the next task that's at the top of the priority list, and that's what you work on next. And it's great for firefighting, right? If all you've got is just fixing bugs, then it's a great approach. Problem is we had a roadmap that we weren't making progress on. So I switched to 1-week deployments instead of, I really wanted 2-week deployments, but I settled for 1 week. And we started doing sprints instead of Kanban. We started planning out. We hired product managers, and we slowed down so that we can make more progress on the bigger picture things. And so you can expend a whole lot of energy on just trying, I did 50 tasks in the last week. Well, that's great, but if those 50 tasks aren't making progress on this long-term roadmap, then there's a problem. And so that's one of the things that I instituted. And then it's a small company, and our teams weren't used to operating that way. It's a whole lot of experiment, and you're going to fail, and then you learn from that and just try to improve. And so I give a whole lot of autonomy to my teams to figure out what to do. When I introduced Agile, when I introduced sprints, I had this phrase that I kept using over and over again. And it was, in the grand Agile tradition, you get to decide how that works, right? So somebody would ask me the question of, well, how should my team size its tasks? It's like, well, in the grand Agile tradition, you get to decide. Should we dedicate one person to fixing bugs so that the others can work on features? I said, well, in the grand Agile tradition, you get to decide, which frustrated the hell out of my team, but it's the right answer, right? I as a VP, am not the person to decide how each one of my engineering teams should operate. So that brings us back to the thing we talked about at the very beginning of software engineering is an engineering problem. I happen to think that those are cool engineering problems to work on. And so that's kind of why I ended up at the Zebra, why it felt like the right place for me, is because I get to go work on stuff like that. And yeah, there are days that I miss writing code and working on robots and things like that, but this is also a cool thing to work on. So I'll end there and just open it up for questions. Nancy.
So in the grand scheme of things in the Agile world, you get to decide to your team members. Then what are some of the tricky, thorny things that they bring to you that have to be untangled?
Where do I start? One of them is really stakeholder management. We're a company that used to be much smaller, and one of the founders is still there and still involved. And he's used to being a 10-person company, and he's got his hands in everything, and he's the one who kind of operates in his mind in Kanban, right? He's just going to keep adding these short-term little things of, hey, this metric is down. Somebody needs to go investigate that. What is up with that? Oh my God, there's a problem. And it's time to panic. And one of the reasons we needed product managers was to hold that off. I don't want my development team to be jerked around like that so much. And so part of it is I'm building a process that manages one of the founders.
You guys had to manage Jeff Pay, so now you're taking.
There was something else I was going to say around that, but anyway, this whole idea of how do I teach my founder how to behave differently with my development team, so that my development team can have the autonomy instead of just always what's the crisis of the day. One of the other things I say about the Zebra car insurance is like, it's the first place I've worked where the products don't kill people. Right? National Instruments, I could build a robot, it can hurt you. Healthcare, medical records, you can accidentally forget to show an allergy, something like that. So when people at the Zebra tell me that there's a crisis and that, oh my God, it's like, I'm sorry, how is this car insurance thing gonna kill somebody? All right, thank you very much, really enjoyed it.